Okay, good morning, everyone. So this morning, Nosh was supposed to give an introduction to you of Ingmar Weber here. Unfortunately, he had to attend to another urgent matter, so I was asked at the last minute to give an introduction. So Ingmar Weber got his PhD from the Max Planck Institute in Computer Science, and he's been working in the area of computational social science since, I guess, like, I first met Ingmar when he was working at Yahoo Research in Barcelona. I guess that's...
Yeah, this was like 5-6 years ago, yeah.
Mm-hmm. And he's been just spearheading the development of this new emerging field of computational social science in various conference venues. You know, whenever I visit these conferences, Ingmar's name is on at least 3 or 4 separate presentations, so he's really productive and active in the development of the field. And currently he is he's a senior scientist at the Qatar Computing Research Institute, directing the social computing.
And actually, yeah, the issue of service, the deep set.
And today, Ingmar will be talking about demographics and social networks, usage differences, content spread, and monopolies. So without further ado, Ingmar Weber.
Definitely do record. I'm happy to share everything from here going forward after the sort of more personal reflections before. So let me talk about a bit of recent and ongoing work. This is work that is done with Jason An, who's at QCI, and with Michael Macy and various people of his team at Cornell University. So first, a bit of warning. So if you're, I'm a vegetarian, I don't eat steak, but if you eat steaks, this kind of, when you order a steak, you can either order it bleu or extra rare to like sort of, trop cuit. And so most of what I'll be talking about is sort of between the bleu and the cuit range in terms of sort of doneness sort of as well. So, but I actually prefer to present work that's not completely polished because I look forward to your feedback just while the work is still ongoing sort of as well. One slide summary. We got a bunch of data from Twitter users from New York City, about 350,000 users. We inferred gender, age, and race from their profile picture. I'll talk more about how that was done in a second. And then we sort of, so we had now this demographic information, and we looked at various sort of things. So first we looked at, users' differences to different age groups, different genders, different races. Use Twitter differently, in New York. So we find, for example, that women, young, and African Americans are the most active users. Older users are more listed, which is a kind of prestige. I'll talk more about that in a second. And also in terms of the hashtags they use, it's mostly intuitive, sort of, so that they would use sort of hashtags that are particular to their demographic groups. Then we look at things related to sort of who are global trend laggards or global trend leaders. And so, as you might expect, sort of, what's globally trending tends to be defined by the biggest groups, right? So this sort of creates sort of like a majority bias, right? Like, so if you look at what's globally trending, it's defined by the biggest group of users, so which makes it harder for minority groups to have sort of their topics trending. Then we look at sort of, how do trends still flow from one group to the other? And as one example, we see evidence that sort of, new music hashtags, for example, tend to start among African American users and then only later are picked up by white users, just to give you some idea of how sort of things move between demographic groups. And then the last thing I'll talk about, there's some evidence for racial discrimination, so at least African American users are the least reciprocated in terms of follow, mentioning, or retweet. So they would follow other users, they would mention other users, they would retweet other users, but they wouldn't be mentioned or followed or retweeted by other users. Right, so the first one is sort of, use it mostly obvious, I guess, to a certain degree. Here again, maybe we can talk about the topic of algorithmic bias and the sort of, tyranny of the majority. Here you could think about applications to early trend spotting, right? Sort of, so if you want to predict what's the hot latest musical trend, tomorrow, sort of so. And here, again, there's a sort of issue, is PageRank bias, sort of so, like, or is PageRank racist? We'll talk about more of that. That's sort of the one slide summary, but just so you don't think, okay, now I can leave. There is more. I will later talk about face-based body mass index. You can just look at your picture and figure out, whether you're overweight or not. We've done some work on how people connect between different languages. We've done some work how people connect between different religions. What happens as your audience grows, actually becomes more diverse. And some fun things of what happens after you break up. How do you rewire your social network? So yeah, stay tuned. So don't. So this will be it. So okay, but now actually getting back to the sort of demographic part. So yeah, data. So how did we get the data? So you know this site? How many have used Follower Wonk? Follower Wonk is a great. So if you use Twitter data, I think it's a site worth knowing. So I'll very quickly show you. So it's the only search engine I know where you can search over Twitter users, not tweets, but Twitter users, right? So for example, if I want to find users who, in their location, mention Evanston. Again, this is self-declared, right? This is not geolocated somehow. They explicitly claim to, and they put student in their bio. Right? So it's kind of like a convenient sample, right? So now I find Travis Ron, Wild for Bunny, whatever. So these are users who mention in their in their location mention Evanston, and somewhere here mention student, right? So this is what we use to find users who self-declare to be in New York, using various sort of strings, right? So again, they might not actually be in New York, there are users who are in New York, etc. But this is sort of what we use as a sort of convenient sample. So this gives us 2.3 million users. Not all of them have an accessible bio. There's sort of some filtering. We filter out users that are less than 3 months old. We partly do this to remove spam. They're typically, eventually, Twitter actually removes spam users. So if you use users who were, created an account longer ago, there's much less spam than if you just use recent accounts. We only look at active users. Then we only subset further to users with a profile picture. There's some chocolate going around, actually camel milk chocolate, so be sure to try some of that if there's some.
Thank you.
And then, so then from the profile picture, we then infer demographics. I'll talk more about how that works in a second. There's some further processing. We only can use users who have accessible tweets. So 350,000 basically is the final user set. And then we analyze their tweets over a 1-year period from sort of late 2014 to late 2015. And we also have their follow network, the mention network, and their retweet network. So within this set of 350,000 users. So So first, if you haven't seen Face++ before, so Face++ is a service that analyzes pictures, right? So you point it to a picture, and it tries to infer lots of things. So here it tries to infer the age. So it says 30 plus minus 5. How old were you at this picture? Just out of interest.
Around 35.
Around 35. Okay, so it's not too bad, right? So in this case, maybe it's 4 or 5 years off, but it's not bad, right? So yeah, so I congratulate you on your testosterone. You're 99.999% male. So anyways, and it thinks you are Asian with an 86.7495% confidence level. So I'd like and again, I'll maybe show you this live as well. Let's try. Okay, so I didn't log in, so let's see. Okay, no share contractor Twitter.com. This okay, no share. Let's see. Okay, here. Copy. Where is it? Copy image location. Okay, right. So you pointed to an image. Okay, too low. Let's see. Okay, I'll try once more. I'm just refreshing. Otherwise, you have to try it yourself later. Okay, maybe there's some network connection. Usually it's quite fast, so I could come back with something that you show for. Okay, sorry for this. I don't know. Anyway, so this is sort of service that we use to annotate those 350,000 users. Now, okay, the question is, does it work? Right? So here is an example of it worked, but of course I selected an example where it worked. Right? So if you look at gender, so we find it sort of compared with like human judgment, we find it to be about 85% accurate, which is not perfect, but it's pretty good sort of. So if you use like standard name dictionaries, you get about 90% plus minus a bit. So it's comparable to just looking at like first name kind of things, right? Of course, the recall is different, right? So some people have a name, not a picture, some have a picture, not a name, etc. Sort of. So, but anyways, so age, yeah. So typically it might be like maybe 7 years off, you know, plus minus 7. So if it says 30, yeah, somebody might be 35 or so, right? But he's typically not 50, and he's typically not 15 either. So you know, it's just like sort of like generations you can typically trust. Race is a bit more complicated, a bit more mixed sort of stuff. So in our data set, when somebody, you know, when it says somebody is white in our data set, in 71% cases it was white. When somebody was labeled as African American, 67%, and when somebody was labeled as Asian, so this is now quite low, you know, it was only 1 out of 4 where it actually was Asian. Now this is because in our data set there were far, far more whites than Asians. So a lot of the cases where the tool came back as saying somebody's Asian was actually somebody being white. So if you look at the recall, sort of, you know, how many Asians are labeled as Asian, it's actually not too bad, and similarly for white and African American. So you think, oh, okay, it's kind of, yeah, not horrible, not great. So is that good enough, right? So clearly, it's, you know, not even the 90+ range. Sort of, so is that good enough? So at least my own feeling is it's kind of okay to study the macro level trends, right? So on average, at least somebody who's labeled as sort of 18 to 24 would, you know, be younger than somebody labeled as 35 to 44. Of course, in any individual case, that might be wrong, but sort of in aggregate, that tends to be fine. So typically, you have somebody labeled as African American. On average, they are more African American than somebody labeled as white. But still, keep in mind that there's certainly noise there, sort of. So. Also, in a certain sense, it weakens the effects but strengthens the conclusions. I mean, if we now have this noisy classifier, and if we see, oh, even with this noisy classifier, there is evidence for discrimination, that kind of means, well, maybe in the, you know, without the noise, the discrimination would be even stronger, right? You could sort of imagine that you want to measure something like network modularity, and now you randomly swap around edges, and you still have a strongly modular network. Well, probably that means the original network is even more modular, right? So that's sort of another way to sort of think about it. And then last but not least, one of the reasons we wanted to use the face rather than the text or the network or other things is that we wanted to have something that is sort of independent of other things, right? Like, for example, if I use the network, your sort of tweet text to infer your age or gender or something or sort of so. Maybe we are friends because we talk about similar topics, right? So now, you know, we might end up being classified in a similar way, and then we see that we are connected. But this kind of, you know, I might follow because of the sort of content. So we didn't want to use things related to language or network information. Right? I could, even if you don't know anything about me, you look at who follows me. You know, they're probably mostly white men, so you can, you know, say something about me. But again, we didn't want to use anything like that. So we think it's a reasonable approach. Definitely it has shortcomings, and I'll talk more about those at the end. But anyway, so that's what we did. So face++. Now for the content, we used a hashtag as a very sort of simple example of a topic. I'll talk more about how we actually infer topics from hashtags in a second. So some small technical details. So we unique every hashtag user day triples. So if a user uses a hashtag like repeatedly on a day, or hashtag Evanston, hashtag Evanston, hashtag Evanston, it would only be counted once. Just typically that gives more robust estimates and sort of avoids, reduces a lot of sort of spam or sort of, so that might be in the system. And then we assign a topic to a hashtag, and I think I have a slide for that as well. So obviously, I mean, inferring so for here, for example, there's a hashtag Veterans Day. In this case, the hashtag itself actually has some meaning, but on Twitter, of course, there are many abbreviations. You have no idea what they're referring to, right? So how do you do topical classification? So what we did is we would randomly collect a bunch of tweets for this topic. In this case, the topic is Veterans Day. I just collected like 4 example tweets. Then we use a tool called Alchemy. Sort of, so many of you probably are familiar with this if you sort of use like NLP type things. And then we upload this concatenation of tweets and say, okay, for this bit of text now, Alchemy, tell me what type of topic do you think, right? In this case, for Veterans Day, it says it's society, unrest and war, law, government and politics, /armed forces /veterans, or finance, personal finance, financial planning, retirement and pension. They're all reasonable, right? Sort of a sort. They're not perfect, sort of a sort. Of course, Veterans Day has to do with retirement. Retirement has to do with pension, so this is maybe not as confident. But the first two are not too bad, right? So we would use the first one in our analysis. Again, it's not perfect, and I'll talk more about the sort of accuracy of. Actually, yeah, we then did some manual post filtering and only keep things where this is, where this is like at least 70% clean. Yeah.
So why did you decide not to throw away the rest of the text? I mean, why just hashtags?
No, we throw in the rest of the text.
You only use hashtagged text.
Yeah. So we want to. So we only look at tweets that have a hashtag. Okay. But now we want to see what that hashtag is about, right? So the reason that we look at hashtag, for example, is so that we think who was the first to use that hashtag, right? If it's sort of who was the first to use the topic, it's a bit fuzzier, right? Because at this sort of high level of so who was the first user to use Veterans Day? Okay, that I can do. And then later we want to see what topic is Veterans Day about, right? So I can see, for new music hashtags, the diffusion is like this. For new hashtags on the topic of unrest and war, the diffusion is like that sort of.
I guess links would have a similar property then.
Links
would have a similar property. Being kind of a unique identifier that way.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, that's true. The links in the UX is true. Yeah, you could use that. Although I think that probably you could use that in different versions. So this is okay. So that's the data. Right? So we have we have users from New York City. We have their different types of networks. We have their demographics, although noisy. We have their hashtags. We have topics for the hashtags, although with a certain amount of noise. Now, what can we do with those things? Right? So let's first look at a very, very simple thing: how do different groups differ in terms of how they use hashtags? Right? So here, let's just start with gender differences. So these are female, male users. So of our users, it's roughly balanced, roughly 50-50. Women are more active in terms of number of tweets. They're more active in terms of number of followers. They're more active in terms of number of friends. So friends, if you're familiar, that's a dual of a follower. I follow somebody, so that person is my friend, but I'm their follower. That's what a friend is. Listed, I mentioned this briefly. So Twitter has these lists. So they are kind of like kind of a sign of status or sort of expertise, right? Damn it. So I didn't log in. Okay. Anyway, so if you go to Noshir's list, I mean, he has created one list himself, but there is also a list that he is in, right? So others create lists of experts in social science, right? And then they would put whatever, Noshir or Michael Macy and others sort of in it, right? So if you have many lists, that kind of is a sign of an expertise, right? So the more listed you are, the more of an expert you are. And some groups, like the group in Max Planck and Saarbrücken uses this actually as a definition of experts, basically. Anyways, favorites, again, it's pretty self-explanatory, and sort of days since joined, pretty similar. Now let's look at sort of differences by race as inferred from this tool. Again, the vast majority of our users are labeled as white, about 3/4 of all users in our data set. If you then look at sort of, in terms of activity rates, the users labeled as African Americans have more tweets, they have more followers, they have more friends, but this is already now interesting, right? So they're less listed than, for example, whites, right? So this is sort of, it's unusual. You sort of expect someone who's more active should also be more listed, but that's not the case, right? Favorites, okay, this sort of, again, different sort of users, so there are some differences. For some reason, users labeled as Asian have much more favoriting. Maybe they use it differently, right? Either they use it more as bookmarking or more as social signaling. I like what you do, so clearly they use Twitter differently. And then last one, sorry, yeah, question. Yeah.
So these are just basic descriptives, and this isn't conditioned on amount of use of the users, for instance?
This is not what?
Conditioned on the amount of
No, so we had all the users joined Twitter at least 3 months ago, and they have at least 10 tweets.
Okay.
But other than that, there's no
Okay.
conditioning. So they're at least already, yeah.
I don't know if you've done it, but because you have the population imbalance in terms of the white and African American, you can potentially have a selection effect where it's the people who intend to be very active, who are African Americans, are drawn to this platform. Those who aren't, just aren't on this platform.
Right.
If you were to condition on, say, they're in the top 50 percentile of Twitter users overall, do
right.
any of these differences go away?
Right. That is a good question. We haven't done that, and actually, there's a nice connection to the next point. So because if we right. So, for example, yeah, here, if we look at, I'll get back to this in a second. If we look at the age distribution, right? So most are in the sort of younger age groups. There are not so many older users, right? So, but then what's interesting is the older users are those that are most listed, so have the status in a certain sense. And they're also the ones that joined Twitter first, right? So now this is kind of like a self-selection bias, right? So if you are on Twitter and if you are in the 60s, you're clearly not representative of general 60-year-old. In the population focus, right? So maybe that relate partly so you join Twitter maybe with a certain purpose or so, right? There's a strong selection bias. But putting aside this sort of like status and when they join, I mean again they have a higher status even though they sort of tweet less, right? Younger users tend to be more active in terms of number of tweets, followers, friends, and...
The meeting has ended because it had only one participant for the last 30 minutes.
Do I have to do it? Help? No? I should continue or... No? Okay. If I'm listening, then it's fine. Okay. Okay. So yeah, so anyway, so women, African American, younger users tend to be more active. Typically, they have more tweets, more followers, more friends. And again, this sort of the fact that the sort of older users that are on Twitter have a higher status, it's kind of like what I call it like a Jackie Robinson effect, like the first Major League African American baseball player, right? I mean, he only made it because he was exceptional, right? So that's how he got to play, right? He was not representative, he was like exceptional, and we observe something similar when we look at gender. This is not Twitter data, this is now Google Plus data. Every data point is a country. And on the y-axis, you have the page rank for a woman. The average woman divided by the average man. So in Egypt, for example, those women that are online on Google Plus have a 20% higher page rank than the men that are online. Right? Even though Egypt or Pakistan, those are clearly very patriotic. Society, and that is true, right? But those women that are online, just a tiny minority, actually are exceptional, right? So, and ironically, like Sweden, Norway, Finland, the opposite holds, right? There, this is sort of from the global gender gap, right? So these countries are doing far better in terms of gender equality, but those women that are online in those, gender balanced countries, are doing worse than the men online, right? So this is kind of like something similar, at least sort of what we observe here with the sort of older users in terms of status. If you look at hashtags, so these are now the most discriminative hashtags. These are not the most frequent hashtags. These are these chi-square sort of, if you want to train a classifier, those would be sort of the features you would put in the classifier. The most frequent ones are very similar. They're like New York, whatever, weather or something. They're very similar, of course. So these are the most discriminative hashtags. Right? So if you use love, makeup, race, anatomy, you tend to be female. If you use mix, NFL, Jets, Mets, NBA finals, you tend to be male. For the sort of racial differences, right? So if you use fresh off the boat or K-pop or Asian American, you tend to be Asian. For African American, there's so Black Lives Matter is an interesting one, right? So this one may be obvious, but right, if you use Black Lives Matter, and there's an indication that you're probably African American, and for sort of white, I don't know. I don't know enough about sort of U.S. culture to make sense of some of these things. I don't know what Bill's Mafia is. For age, so just very quickly, right? Again, it's some sensible sort of things, right? So here you have growing up, teen choice, Today's, this is ironic, right? So these kind of teenagers, they already look back and say, today's kids will never know, right? So, oh, I'm already so old, things changed so much during the last 10 years, right? It's almost ironic, right? And so I'm clearly in the big data age, right? So this is my age group. So if you use big data, that's typical for my age apparently. And then the older users are the ones that, in terms of discriminative topics like things related to politics, would be most indicative of being older on Twitter. Okay, this was just like a very general sort of like description, sort of like exploring the data. So now let's look more sort of at trending, like who is first, who is last in terms of who's things. So for that, I first have to define trends and how we measure trends. Okay, so the way we define, so first we only look at hashtags for this, so we look at hashtags, and basically we define a hashtag as trending if there's a large volume and if the hashtag is new. That's sort of the very, very, very basic idea. Now, a bit more concretely, so we define a hashtag to be trending on a given day if the hashtag for a given group, let's say among the whites, is in the top 10 in terms of volume. So that's one criteria. And the other criteria is so the hashtag was not in the top 10 for the 10 previous days. It's like a new thing. It's not like hashtag New York or something or so, which might be always in the top 10 or something or so. It has to be new to a certain degree. So that's very, very, very basic, very simplistic, and you could look at other derivatives that's on the rise or something. It's new and coming or so. Now here we very high volume and seems to be new. That's how we define sort of trending for this. Now we sort of compute what's trending within each group, and then we sort of compare to the global group. So among all the 350. Okay. Okay. Should I click anything, or if not, I'll just go back to the slide deck for now. Or I mean, I can continue. I just want to make sure. Okay. 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 Right. So we have a sort of high volume and new hashtags, and then we compare this with the sort of global group. Like among all 350,000 users, among that group, what is new and what is high volume? This is sort of like the global reference, right? What is trending among this group? What's trending among all the users combined, right? This is sort of what we would compare. And then we have two different types of groups. So by marginal group, I don't mean marginalized. I mean sort of like a probability distribution type of sense. So we just say man, women, or particular age, particular range. Only looking at the gender, not the age, not the race. This would be what we call like a marginal group in terms of like marginal distribution. When I refer to a joint group, we mean like young men that are white or old women that are Asian. Right? This would be like a joint group. We have sort of like the joint probability for the different things. So we have analyzed both of those cases. Now again, we use the sort of what's globally trending as reference, and then we sort of compare. Okay, so for everything that is globally trending within a group, the group is now either a marginal group or a joint group. This listing what was globally trending, was it trending on the same day within the group? Was it never trending within that group? Was it sort of trending but one day later? So it first trended globally and then it trended one day later? Or was it the other way around? Right? So it was first trending among the local group and it was sort of trending globally, so to speak, later. And then we've explored like different cutoffs for one day earlier, later, or within the next week. But the results were pretty much the same, so I'll just present the ones for one day. So, right, so here, so if somebody, the globally trending ones, how are they distributed across the different groups? So, the group is leading means the group is using a hashtag before it becomes globally trending. Right? A group is lagging means a group is using the hashtag after it was globally trending. If the group same day is kind of self-explanatory. Right? So now this is just these are the two biggest groups, obviously. So the vast majority of things would be on the same day because to a certain degree they define what's globally trending, right? So in terms of how many sort of hashtags they have trending, it's about the same for both groups.
Just a quick
Yeah.
question. So how do you determine if a hashtag is trending within a group?
It's the same, yeah. So it would be the same definition. So it would have to have to be on the top 10 in terms of volume within that group. So just look at all the hashtags used by that group within that day. What's the top 10? Okay, so one condition is the hashtag needs to be in the top 10 for that group. So only look at Asian users. Right? Only Asian users on that day. What's their top 10? One condition needs to be in the top 10. The other condition is it must not have been in the top 10 on one of the 10 previous days. So it must sort of like high volume and new to a certain degree. Very simplistic, but that's sort of like how it's defined. You know, we played a bit with different sort of definitions and different cutoffs or sort of so, but it's pretty much qualitatively the same. Other questions as well? I mean, hopefully we'll have more discussions with later. So anyway, so here in terms of sort of gender, so if you look at how often a group is lagging versus leading, so like a high ratio would potentially be, it's behind the global trend. A low ratio would be sort of be ahead of the global trend. So it's actually interesting that women have a sort of higher, lower lag to lead ratio. If you look at it sort of broken down by race, again, I'm not going to all of them. If you just look at sort of at this ratio, again, you would sort of find that whites, tend to lead more than they lag, and the opposite holds for African American users. You can break it down by age group as well. Here it's sort of interesting that it's sort of middle-aged group which tends to do the most, again, compared to the global reference, and we get to that in a second. Right? Of course, the whites are also the ones that kind of define what's globally trending, so obviously, those are size effects that we look at in a second. Yeah, actually, so here we now do the same analysis, but for these joint groups. So we look for like young men that are Asian, etc. sort of, and we do sort of the same sort of thing. How often are they lagging, leading, etc. And then we look at their group size, just because obviously it is easier for a bigger group to define what's globally trending, right? Because they are part of the global trend. And we sort of see these are now correlations with the sort of group size. So the bigger the group, the more often they would have hashtags kind of trending within the group that are also globally trending, right? Kind of obvious to a certain degree because they are sort of defining the group, right? And the less likely they are to lag, etc. Right? So this kind of hints at this sort of obvious algorithmic bias, right? Like if you just look at the whole bunch to define what's trending, of course that tends to be more influenced by the biggest groups. So the minorities would have it harder time to actually define what's trending. We also, just for the interest, we looked at whether the median number of followers in a group is an indication of what's eventually globally trending or not. Not so much. I mean, yes, there's some. I mean, actually, no. Actually, groups that have a higher followers. I mean, it's basically not even significant. But if anything, they tend to lag more. So it's not about the number of followers in this analysis. Okay, so this was just sort of compared to the sort of global thing, but now let's look at how do things move from one group to another group. So this is sort of now what I call a demographic flow. And so let me first explain what I mean by demographic flow, right? So an example is sort of hip-hop music, right? So hip-hop music started, again, I'm not an expert, this is just what I've learned from Wikipedia, so to speak, right? Like, so, but it started in the 70s in mostly African-American neighborhoods. But now it's arguably mainstream, and this is how I find out about this was through a Radio Lab episode, so Radio as a podcast, but a story about Peter Rosenberg, right, who's a sort of, who's a Jewish person living in New York City, comes from a sort of white suburban neighborhood, but he's now a hip-hop, like, DJ and expert, and he kind of gets to define what is proper hip-hop now, right? Like, no, this is not real hip-hop, this is real hip-hop, right? And he's now a gatekeeper for hip-hop, right? Like a white dude from a sort of suburban neighborhood, right? It's kind of like, this sort of shows you that it's sort of flowed, right? Hip-hop has sort of now flowed from, let's say, African Americans to a white, right? This is sort of what I mean by demographic flow. It flows from one group to another group. And this is very much like a macro, not a micro level description. I'm not saying via this user and then to that user. I'm just saying from this demographic group, at some point in time to that other demographic group at a later point in time. Right? So this is what I call demographic flow. Actually got interested in this while I was there at Yahoo. So let me give you an interest from a search, from the example of web search. Here is data. I'll explain exactly what this means second for searches on Yahoo for Avatar movie. Now, Avatar, the movie, came out in January 2010. That's when the movie was released. So in blue, you have the search volume over time, right? So as the movie was released, huge peak in search. There's nothing really surprising there at all. But now in pink or in green, you have information about the birth year of users issuing that query. Okay, there's pink is median and green is average, pretty much the same behavior. So on the y-axis, a large value means a high birth year means young. So here, users were fairly young that issued that query, and as the sort of release date approaches, users on average and in the median get older and older and older. Right? So kind of who searches for a movie like half a year before it's released, right? Like who would do that, right? These are kind of like the really passionate people about something. But I mean, I had never heard of Avatar like so far in advance, right? And so you can kind of see that the movie is kind of flowing from young to older, right? Furthermore, if you look at the sort of the spread, how much it's sort of spread in terms of age range, you also see here it's sort of more concentrated, whereas if you compare this, to the later bars, it's sort of more spread, right? So here sort of something comes from a niche, like from a young group, and sort of flows to the whole population. Right? So this is sort of what happened for Avatar movie. Now it's not always the case that something flows from niche to the mainstream, and it stays in the mainstream. It can go back to being a niche thing. So this is maybe more surprising. So here is again search data. So in this case, it's for queries for Ben Bernanke. So Ben Bernanke was a former head of the Federal Reserve Bank, if I'm not mistaken, right? And so here, what you would see again on blue is search volume. So the search volume was high whenever there was some news, right? Or the Federal Reserve Bank decided to increase interest rates, whatever, right? So then, who's that Ben Bernanke guy, right? So then everybody would sort of search for it, right? So then no news, no interest, and then again search. So this, again, blue is just, a peak corresponds to some news event. Now what you have in green and in pink is now the percentage of users inferred from their zip code. So again, this is noisy, but as inferred from their zip code, who have a bachelor degree. So high means more educated, low means less educated. Now what is interesting is whenever there's high volume, the education level drops. When the volume drops again, it becomes like a low interest type thing, right? The sort of the education level rises again. It goes back to sort of the niche, right? And then again, everybody searches, so that means sort of the education level drops again, right? So here you have something that sort of flows, kind of, when there's volume, it flows from the niche to the public, and then the interest dies, and it goes back to the niche again, to the public, to the niche, kind of to the public, to the niche, right? So you have not always this behavior. You can also have this type of behavior. Anyway, so this is what I mean by demographic flow. Now, what does that mean for sort of hashtags? So here we were sort of interested in, does one group use a hashtag before another group, right? And so we were sort of looking at how often does this happen that one group uses a hashtag one day before another group, and we just sort of count how often that happens, and we can come up with some strength of how strongly one group leads another group. So now if you just look at globally, which are sort of now the joint groups that globally sort of lead most often, this is sort of what you find, right? So it's dominated by white, and interestingly by actually women, right? So now, but if you now here's a nice picture, sort of, so if you're interested, sort of, so this means sort of, this group dominates this group, and there are certain, like, basically the size corresponds to how much they dominate other groups, and the color, how many other groups they dominate, right? So this would be a lagging group, and this would be sort of like a leading group, right? So just global, not topic specific, but sort of with respect to sort of the other groups. Now, okay, this is sort of hard to parse, but what is more fun is now to look at this at a sort of topic-specific level, right? So now, again, we also include the topics for the hashtags, as I mentioned. So you can look at hashtags for art and entertainment and music, or hashtags for movies, hashtags for baseball, hashtags about basketball, etc. Right? And then again, you can sort of see who are the sort of the top leaders, right? And now you see different pictures, right? So for example, now here for music, it is young male African Americans that are sort of leading most, for example, right? So for movies, for some reason, again, I don't know. For movies would be female African Americans, and then here's a nice difference, right? Baseball, whites are sort of leading, basketball, African Americans are leading, right? So it's also interesting. Like I wasn't aware to me, like kind of the distinction between the different types of sports. Again, there are different. I mean, we're not going to go through all the things, just to show you what you can do with this type of things. Now, yes, I think timing is good. Just before ending, basically on this sort of the whole demographics part, maybe about the most interesting part. This is the least finished surface, right? So before telling you the results, let's maybe think about, okay, what would racial discrimination in a social network look like, right? If you don't have any content, just suppose like who, you're not like, oh, I hate you, whatever, so you some name call, you just look at how people connect, right? Suppose, again, here's a social demographic network with different races. Suppose only these two people are connected, these two people are connected, and these two people are connected. Nothing else, right? Is this discrimination, or is this just homophily, right? So I just, these people hang out with similar people, these people hang out with similar people, these people hang out with similar. Is this discrimination? I don't know, not really. Right? It's segregation or sort of a separation, but is it discrimination? Not sure, right? But what about now this setting, right? So they follow these people, but they don't follow back. That smells a bit differently now, right? So now you might think maybe this is now some evidence for this. Again, there could be other reasons for that happening, and I'll talk more about that. But at least you would kind of, suppose that discrimination should imply that. I'm not necessarily saying that this kind of structure would always imply the other thing, but sort of, at least I would hypothesize, and I'd love to hear your thoughts afterwards, that discrimination should imply this type of link imbalance, right? So now again, so we spoke about the graph, now we thought about the network, now we actually look at how people connect to each other, both in the follow, mention, and retweet graph. Fortunately, they get very, very similar results qualitatively, so I'll only mention results for the follow network, about 350,000 nodes, 8 million edges. So just again, sort of very, very high levels. So this is the number of nodes in the network, and sort of about 3/4 are white. These are the number of users who have at least one following edge, who follow at least one user. These are the number of users who have at least one followed edge, so who are followed by at least one user. This is the average out degree across all users. This is the average out degree. So out means following others. So how many others do I follow? This is now the out degree only across users who follow at least one other user. This is the out degree across all users. This is the in degree. So just one thing you already sort of noticed so that for example, whites have a higher in degree than out degree, right? And the same holds for Asians. Asians have a higher in degree than out degree, but the opposite holds for African Americans. Right? African Americans follow more others in the network than they are followed by. Right? So this is sort of one thing. You can look at the entropy in terms of racial sort of entropy. There's sort of three classes, right? Like how do you sort of, anyway, so you just look at how diverse the people are that either follow you or that you follow. That you follow or that you follow you. And again, you see sort of like a similar pattern that African Americans are the most diverse, or in terms, highest entropy in terms of who they follow, and whites would be least diverse. And again, of course, obviously, if you're part of the majority group, if you just pick friends that are around you, again, this is not necessarily an indication for discrimination, but it's just interesting to look at. So now, let's look at or maybe just break down. Actually, there's not enough time. Okay, here's just who's following whom. Right? So here's who's doing the following, and then sort of normalized by who's followed. Here it's normalized by who is followed and where does it come from, right? So it's the same sort of data, but normalized differently. In both cases, each user contributes the same. So these are normalized such that it's not dominated by one user who follows like a billion other users. Each user contributes the same for both of these graphs, right? So there's in all cases there is some slight, within group preferences, right? Like overall, only 3/4 of users are white, but whites tend to follow more than 3/4, right? So similarly, the other groups also have homophily. So Asian to Asian is more likely than expected. African American to African American is more likely than expected. Now the last thing is now the sort of reciprocation probability. So here is again sort of who's doing the following and who is followed, right? So here a white person is connecting to an Asian person. What's the probability that this is reciprocated? Same thing here. The difference between these graphs is here it's not edge weighted. So here actually a user with many edges would dominate the statistics. Here it's again user weighted, where so here each user contributes the same, but only users who actually connect to other people, right? If a white user never ever connects to an Asian, there would be nothing here contributing. Right. And so here now you sort of see that the reciprocation. This is the following. This is I'm sorry. It's been a long day. You have to compare now. So right. Did I swap that? Sorry, if a white. Yeah. So okay. So for example, okay, you can feel it this way, right? So if a white initiates it, right? So African Americans tend to follow back much more than all the other races. That's sort of one of the things. So they seem to be more social, or at least I don't know, Twitter, whatever. So they have a higher reciprocation probability. So that's sort of one generically, right? Like even for a white user, you would have, if you want to boost your followership, you're more likely to get a refollow from an African American user than from a white user. But now, what is interesting is still that so who actually now reciprocates African Americans, right? So now here, whites would be less likely to do this than Asians, and here also so that whites would be less likely to reciprocate. So this is now reciprocation, right? So who's reciprocated by
is that given that an Asian is following a white, what's the probability that a white will also follow?
Yeah, here it's the following. Here's the followed, right? So here, given that an Asian is following an Asian, he has a higher than 55% chance of being followed back. Given an Asian is following an African American, it's sort of similar. Given an Asian is following, this is how that materials at the edge level. So generally, of course, again, so here whites generally reciprocate less. That's one thing. That's a global thing. But here whites, so this is, for example, this column is maybe interesting. So of course whites generally reciprocate less than African Americans, but they would also reciprocate least to African Americans compared to other races, and the same is true here. So this is sort of like one way sort of to view this. Sorry, this question.
So you removed the people who didn't do much tweeting and everything at the initial. Did you consider removing like the top 5% of heavy users just to make sure they weren't skewing?
Right. So that's a good question. So here they are. Here every user contributes the same on this side. So here, even if you only follow 2 people, right? So and one happens to be whatever African American, potentially white, you contribute the same to this part than me who's following 1,000 people, So here, that shouldn't. Here, you're right. This would be biased. So if one Asian user tries to connect to all 350,000 other users, basically that would just be his results. You know, he would sort of dominate this site. Okay. Okay. I was already 11. Okay. Sorry. Yeah. So. Okay. Maybe I'll just leave this sort of up here. Right. So there are lots of alternative explanations, right, rather than discrimination. Right. There could be different usage. Maybe people use it for information versus social network. Right. And maybe even people who have a face have a stronger racial identity. That's not. You know, there are lots of different things. This I already mentioned. Maybe quickly, we also found some evidence for face++ being correlated with a network, so that users who tend to bridge between races have a higher misclassification error. Maybe they look more mixed racial or something, or sort of, even though we didn't find this. So this is a bit worrying, although the error was not as, the correlation with the network was not as high that it should really affect things, but we have to look a bit more closer at that. Because that was the whole point of using something that's not correlated with the network. If now it turns out that the error is correlated with the network, that is what. Just very, very quickly, just then I'll finish. We also doing things related to BMI, right? We have done some work just manually annotating users, whether they are obese or not, and seeing how they connect. Users who look overweight have fewer followers. I can explain that more. Now we're doing that automatically with people at CSAIL, where we try to train a machine just to infer your BMI by looking at your profile picture. Happy to explain that more. We've done some work on how people connect across languages. So this is a social network graph from Turkey for Qatar. We've done something similar for Switzerland. Happy to explain that more. How people connect across religions. Again, these are self-declared users. So here somebody would write animal lover, foodie, model Buddhist. Somebody would write Islam 100%. So we would sort of use their self-declared religion and see how people connect. Obviously, there's within religion homophily, but what's interesting is that the more followers you have, the lower that gets, right? Like the Pope is different from a bishop. Like if you're the Pope, everybody follows the Pope. You don't have to be religious, right? So it's just a celebrity. If you're a bishop, it will be very different kind of thing, right? And so this is a similar thing we're looking here. Like what happens as your audience scales up? How does it change in terms of quality? So they become less and less like you. Like the more followers you have, the less is any one follower like you. Right? Can you explain more about that? And of relationship breakups, very quickly, we looked at users who used to mention each other in the profile, right? So here's a fake profile. I'm in love with this other user, and then we would monitor them over time, and then suddenly the reference to the other user would disappear, right, from their profile. Right? So we would say this is when they broke up. This is how users mention each other before they break up, when they still have the mention. This is how they mention each other after the breakup. These are public tweets, right? So it's a change in tone. And now what's happening to the network is interesting. So just very, very quickly, so basically you lose about 20 friends and 20 followers, both friends and followers, during the time of the network. So these are people who break up. These numbers go down from during the week of the breakup, and then they start climbing up again. So you lose both 20 friends and followers during the wake of the breakup. Unfortunately, we don't know the identity, so we can't really look at whether these are now, all connected to your partner or something or so. But we think yes, that we didn't collect the information. Sorry for running over time. It was.
Questions? I have one question though. So when you talk of the face++ step over there, and when you throw in the pictures of all the users into that software, how do you actually make sure that you have clarity in those pictures, or does face++ give you some indication?
Right. Yeah. So face++ does come back with the confidence for all of those things. Okay. We did not filter by that confidence. We could have filtered by that confidence. So if the user, if the face is not even visible, it would not try to infer anything. So it only returns anything if it is somewhat confident, right? It would not never. But you could potentially filter on.
So you have your own benchmark scores over which you're going to select those.
Right. Here we actually did not filter by confidence, but we could have used it as a score. We didn't experiment trying to remove users with lower confidence or so. So maybe.
Go ahead.
Oh, okay. One thing, I was looking at Laura Wonk, and it's being sunsetted, unfortunately.
It's what is being?
Sunsetted?
Interesting.
They're shutting it down.
Okay.
They're looking for a buyer, in fact.
Okay.
I was also wondering, have you tried looking at some of these results, filtering out people who have reached essentially a celebrity status because they have so many followers?
Right. We haven't explicitly figured it out, but pretty much all the things we do are user-weighted rather than edge-weighted, right? So at least, at least each user should have the same weight in the analysis, not each edge, right? So in that sense, I wouldn't expect them to dominate in any way because I can't exactly see how. But yeah, we should look into that, how things change when we remove those. We haven't done it.
I think actually the problem for the user weight is on the other side. It's not on the celebrities necessarily. It's on the people who, and this goes back to my first question, the people who are, I'm on Twitter because everyone I work with is also on Twitter, but I'm that white guy that's driving down the mean big time because I think I've tweeted maybe 20 times in my entire life. So when you're
those are also median. Sorry, I mean, anyways, at least it's the average mean. But
I'm saying for the user weighting, if there is differential selection onto Twitter by group, then you're going to be overweighting those groups that are disproportionately selecting to be on Twitter in the first place, even if they don't intend to use it all that much.
Right.
But I get the user weight, and I think for the top end, it makes total sense.
Yeah. Question there?
Yeah, one of the tempting things to do with all this demographic data is to start talking about what groups are actually representative. You can take that older people.
What groups are actually?
Like actually representative of the general population.
Can you repeat the question, Ingmar, for the recording?
Yeah. So the question is, which groups are actually representative? And there's a lot of interest in that, especially with sort of, can you use Twitter for surveying, like for election prediction and these kind of things, like which groups are representative, which groups do you have to correct for, apply some kind of stratification or sort of. So it's an excellent point. So again, in our own analysis, going back to the sort of country analysis that I mentioned, we sort of saw that at least just scaling up will not work, right? Like those women online in Pakistan or Egypt are clearly not representative of all the women in Pakistan or Egypt. So definitely we have to look more into what subgroups are somehow representative or how. I mean, we are looking into this. Like, how can we de-bias, sort of data? How can we, get closer to, something that is representative?
Larry? When I think about discrimination, the question that comes to my mind is compared to what? And, that makes me think that there's probably some stuff to be mined in thinking about not exactly necessarily different kinds of social network platforms, although that might be interesting too, but just, if I look at media, how many people get to, kind of write in the general media versus how, and sort of these kinds of ratios, if you make estimates in the media versus looking at this platform as, how reciprocal it is, for example. And I'm not quite sure how I would do that, but I think there might be, kind of ways to think about doing that would actually sort of, because I might be completely wrong, but I mean, my sense is that these networks, for all their flaws, are actually more democratic than what was historically available from the point of view of, giving people a voice. So I would love to be able to show that, though, or to find a way for somebody to show that. So
yeah, I mean, at least we could consider like a cross-country comparison. Is this in Canada differently or something? That might be one way to give you a reference point.
Yeah, or over time, for example.
Anyway.
Yeah. I think this is one of the challenges of focusing on Twitter.
Yeah.
Because you're trying to say it's compared, you said it's compared to what?
Yeah.
And that's why some people say that this is a great science in the area of Twitterology, but not necessarily sociology overall, because it may not be reflecting what happens offline.
But it's so publicly and easily available anyway. Right.
Any last questions? Well, thanks again, Ingmar, for coming and giving us. And I should mention in closing that on the 29th of this month, we are actually hosting an event here in Chicago, which is part of a global telethon, webathon, I should say, to celebrate the 10th anniversary of Web Science. And so from 10:30 to 1:30 at the Allen Center, we have a set of activities and events, and if there are folks here or your students who would have web-related research that they would want to showcase, so it starts in the morning in Singapore time, and then goes to Berlin, London, and then ends in Chicago, that thing. So I'm hoping to be in touch and follow up with some of you so that we can have a turnout. It's going to be held at the Allen Center.
It's a great idea.
Yep.
Thanks for accommodating the time, Jim. Also, I appreciate it.
Oh, of course.
Yeah. Good to see you.
Yeah, likewise.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Well, going to the early one, so
Otherwise, given the stuff with science,
Yeah, definitely.